Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into a tool called Gatekeeper.
Uh-huh.
And, you sent over some fantastic resources about how to use this to keep Kubernetes clusters secure and compliant.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah, me too.
Just a quick, super high level, for anyone listening who might not be familiar with Kubernetes.
Yeah.
This is the leading platform for container orchestration.
Yeah, it's kind of become the industry standard at this point.
It is, right. So,
Yeah.
when we talk about security and compliance in this context,
Yeah.
we're talking about some pretty serious stuff because things can get
Absolutely.
out of control pretty quickly if you don't have the right safeguards in place.
It can be pretty chaotic if you're not careful. Yeah.
So, let's talk about gatekeepers.
Yeah.
What is this thing? How do we even start to wrap our heads around it in the simplest terms?
Yeah, I think a good analogy is to think of gatekeepers as like a security guard right at the entrance of your Kubernetes cluster.
I like that.
It's there to prevent any unwanted actions or configurations from making their way in.
Okay, so it's like a bouncer.
Yeah, basically. It's checking IDs, making sure everyone who's coming in has the right credentials and is allowed to be there.
So in more technical terms, I saw in one of the articles you sent over
Yeah.
that Gatekeeper is an admission controller for something called Open Policy Agent, or OPA.
That's right. Yeah.
Can you kind of unpack that a little bit?
Sure. So OPA is like a general purpose policy engine. It's an open source project, and it's designed to help you enforce policies across all sorts of different systems and applications.
Okay.
And Gatekeeper specifically is an admission controller for OPA, which means that it's designed to integrate OPA into Kubernetes.
So it's like a specialized version of OPA.
Exactly. Yeah. It's purpose-built for Kubernetes.
Got it.
So Gatekeepers takes those policies that you define in OPA and it uses them to control what actions are allowed within your Kubernetes cluster.
Okay, so it's all about making sure that every change that happens within the cluster follows the rules.
Yeah, exactly. It's like having a set of rules and regulations that everyone has to follow.
And these rules are defined in something called CRDs. Custom Resource Definitions, I think.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
I saw that mentioned a few times.
Yeah, so CRDs are a way to extend the Kubernetes API, which basically means you can create your own custom objects within Kubernetes. And with Gatekeepers, you define your policies as CRDs.
Okay.
So they become like native objects within your Kubernetes cluster.
Okay.
It makes them really easy to manage and integrate with other Kubernetes tools.
So it's all about keeping things consistent and making those security policies a first-class citizen within the Kubernetes ecosystem.
Exactly. It's not some kind of afterthought. It's baked right in.
I like that.
Yeah.
And I also noticed you sent over an article from the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, as a CNCF.
Yes.
I think I'm right in saying they're the folks behind Kubernetes?
That's right. Yeah, they're kind of the stewards of the Kubernetes project.
So what's their involvement with Gatekeepers? Are they just sort of watching from the sidelines, or?
No, they're actually pretty heavily involved.
Okay.
So the CNCF actually hosts the Gatekeeper project, which lends it a lot of credibility.
Yeah.
The CNCF has a really strong reputation for backing high-quality open source projects that have a strong community behind them.
Yeah, that's a big deal in this world, right?
It is, yeah. It's kind of a stamp of approval.
Okay, so we know now what it is. We know who's behind it. But why should anyone care? What's in it for me as someone who's maybe managing a Kubernetes cluster?
Right. Well, imagine you're responsible for a large and complex Kubernetes environment.
Okay.
You might have dozens or even hundreds of developers deploying new code and making changes on a daily basis.
That sounds pretty hectic.
It can be, yeah. And without a robust policy enforcement mechanism, it's incredibly difficult to keep track of everything that's happening and ensure that everyone is following security best practices.
Yeah. I mean, trying to do that manually would be a nightmare.
It would be like trying to herd cats.
Okay, so Gatekeeper takes that burden off your shoulders.
Exactly. It automates the entire process of policy enforcement, so you define the rules once. And Gatekeepers ensures that they are applied consistently across your entire cluster, no matter how many developers you have or how frequently they're making changes.
So it's always on, always watching.
Exactly. It's like having that security guard we talked about earlier, constantly patrolling your cluster, making sure that everything is in order.
Okay, now I know security and compliance are often mentioned in the same breath.
Yeah.
But they're not exactly the same thing, right?
They are distinct, but they're definitely related.
So how does Gatekeepers address both of those concerns?
Well, security is about protecting your systems and data from unauthorized access and attacks. while compliance is more about meeting specific industry regulations and standards. Gatekeepers can address both of these by allowing you to define policies that enforce both security best practices and compliance requirements.
Okay, so it's like a single tool that can handle both sides of that coin.
Exactly, yeah. You don't need separate systems for security, and for compliance, you can manage it all in one place.
Now, one of the things that really jumped out at me in these articles was this emphasis on developer independence.
Yeah.
How does gatekeepers play into that? Because sometimes it feels like security can be a roadblock for developers.
It can be.
They just want to get their work done.
Yeah, they want to move fast and iterate quickly.
Right.
And security checks can sometimes slow them down.
So how do we balance those two things?
Well, that's where Gatekeeper comes in.
Okay.
Because it allows you to shift security left.
What does that mean?
It means that you integrate security directly into the development process. So developers can define their own policies as code, and they can test them locally, which means that they can ensure that their code adheres to security guidelines before it even reaches the cluster.
So it's like baking security into the development process from the get-go.
Exactly. It's not an afterthought. It's part of the process from the very beginning.
And that empowers developers to kind of work independently without having to constantly check in with the security team.
Exactly. It gives them more autonomy while still maintaining a high level of security.
Okay, and all of this scales right.
It does, yeah.
Because Kubernetes environments can get pretty big.
They can get very large, yeah.
So gatekeepers can handle that.
Absolutely. It's designed to scale whether you have a small cluster with a handful of developers or a massive enterprise environment with hundreds of applications. Gatekeepers can grow with you.
That's great because you don't want to have to constantly be re-architecting your security posture as your infrastructure expands.
No, you want something that can adapt and grow with you, and that's what Gatekeeper is designed to do.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about what Gatekeeper is. We've talked about why it matters.
Right.
But how does this thing actually work on like a technical level? Let's pop the hood and take a look inside.
Okay, let's do it.
Remember we talked about gatekeepers acting as an admission controller?
Yeah.
That's how it intercepts those requests, right?
That's right. And it achieves this by using something called webhooks.
Webhooks, okay.
Which are essentially HTTP callbacks that are triggered by certain events in Kubernetes.
So every time someone tries to do something in the cluster, Gatekeeper gets notified via a webhook.
Exactly. And this is where OPA comes into play.
Okay.
So when Gatekeeper receives a webhook request, it forwards that request to OPA for evaluation.
And OPA uses those REGO policies to determine if the request is allowed or not.
Exactly. OPA is like the judge.
Okay.
It compares the request to the rules that are defined in the REGO policies. And if the request violates a policy, OPA signals gatekeepers to reject it.
So it's a real-time decision-making process happening behind the scenes.
Yes, very fast.
Okay. And if the request passes muster, everything just kind of sails through smoothly.
Exactly. The developer wouldn't even know that Gatekeeper is there. Everything just works as expected.
Okay. But if the request violates a policy,
then it gets blocked.
It's like a big stop sign.
Exactly. OPA signals gatekeepers to reject the request, and Kubernetes blocks the action.
And the user gets an error message explaining why.
Yeah, typically they'll get a message saying, hey, this action is not allowed because it violates this policy.
So that feedback loop is really important.
It is. It helps developers understand what they did wrong and how to fix it.
Okay, so we've got the webhook notification. We've got OPA evaluating the request against the REGO policies. And then ultimately, a decision is made to either allow or block that action.
Exactly. That's the whole process in a nutshell.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about what Gatekeeper is. We've talked about why it's so important in the world of Kubernetes.
Right.
But now let's get down to the nitty-gritty.
Okay.
How do we actually implement gatekeepers? What are the steps involved?
Okay, so the first step is to install Open Policy Agent, or OPA, into your Kubernetes cluster.
So that's like laying the foundation.
Exactly. Yeah,
wow.
You need to have that policy engine in place before you can do anything else.
Makes sense.
There are a couple of different ways to install OPA, but using Helm charts is usually the most straightforward approach.
Okay.
So you can find a Helm chart for OPA and use that to deploy it into your cluster.
And Helm charts are those pre-packaged Kubernetes configurations, right?
Exactly. They make deployments much easier because they handle a lot of the complexity for you.
So once we have OPA up and running, what's next?
And you need to deploy Gatekeeper itself.
Okay.
And you can also use Helm charts for that, or you can use YAML manifests if you prefer a more manual approach.
And YAML manifests are those configuration files that define Kubernetes objects, right? It's like the blueprint.
Right, exactly. They give you fine-grained control over how Gatekeeper is deployed.
Okay, so now we have OPA installed. We have gatekeepers deployed.
Yeah.
What's the next step in this process?
Now comes the fun part. You get to define your policies.
This is where the rubber meets the road.
Exactly. This is where you get to use the Rego language that we talked about earlier
to
actually specify the rules that will govern your Kubernetes environment.
So we're not just talking about basic security rules here.
No, you can get really specific with Rego.
Yep.
You can control everything from which containers are allowed to run to how network traffic is routed.
So we can really tailor these policies to our specific needs.
Exactly. That's the power of Rego. It gives you a lot of flexibility and expressiveness.
So we've defined our policies using Rego.
Yeah.
What's next? Do we just unleash them on our production cluster?
Not so fast. You always want to test your policies thoroughly before you deploy them to production.
Okay, safety first.
Right. So you'll want to set up a staging environment that mirrors your production cluster as closely as possible.
So basically a sandbox where we can experiment without breaking anything important?
Exactly. Once you have your staging environment set up, you can deploy your Gatekeeper policies and run various tests to make sure that they are working as expected.
And this is where those error messages that we talked about earlier come in handy.
They do. If your policies are too restrictive, you'll start seeing those error messages pop up during your testing. And that'll give you a chance to adjust your policies accordingly.
So it's an iterative process.
It is, yeah. You define your policies, you test them, you refine them, and you repeat until you're confident that they're ready for prime time.
Got it. And then finally we deploy to production.
Exactly. Once you're happy with how your policies are working in staging, you can deploy them to production.
And from that point on, Gatekeepers is on duty 24/7, enforcing those policies and keeping our clusters secure.
That's right. It's like having an automated security guard that never sleeps.
Fantastic. All right, so we've covered the what and the why of Gatekeepers. We've even touched on the how of implementing it. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that I want to talk about before we wrap up this first part.
Okay.
You sent over an article that mentioned something called constraint templates.
Yes.
What are those, and how do they fit into the whole Gatekeeper picture?
So constraint templates are a really powerful feature of Gatekeepers that allow you to define reusable policy building blocks.
Okay.
So think of them as blueprints for creating specific types of policies.
So instead of writing every single policy from scratch, you can use constraint templates to create sort of a library of predefined policy patterns.
Exactly. And this makes it much easier to create and manage policies, especially if you have a large and complex Kubernetes environment.
So it's like having a toolkit for building security policies.
Exactly. You can mix and match different constraint templates to create the policies that you need.
And they're customizable, right?
They are, yeah. You can define parameters that allow users to tailor the policy to their specific needs without having to modify the underlying Rego code.
So it's a way to create policies that are both flexible and standardized.
Exactly. That's one of the key features that makes Gatekeeper so versatile and adaptable to different environments.
I think this is a great place to pause for now.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still much more to explore.
Absolutely.
In the next part, we'll dive deeper into those constraint templates. We'll look at some real-world examples of how Gatekeeper is being used.
Yeah.
And we'll even touch on some of the challenges of implementing Gatekeepers.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
All right. So until next time, keep those Kubernetes clusters secure, and we'll see you back here soon.
See you then.
Bye. Bye. So we left off talking about those constraint templates.
We did.
And how they can help us build a more secure Kubernetes environment.
Yeah. You know, thinking about it, it's making me wonder how we could use constraint templates to address some of the specific concerns I have about my own clusters.
Okay, like what kind of concerns?
Well, honestly, the thing that keeps me up at night is making sure our deployments don't accidentally expose sensitive data.
Yeah, that's a big one.
You know, we handle a lot of personal information, and a misconfiguration could be a disaster.
Absolutely. That's a very valid concern, and it's one that Gatekeepers can definitely help with.
Okay, so how do constraint templates come into play here?
Well, you could use a constraint template to create a policy that enforces specific security labels on all your deployments.
Okay.
For example, you could require that any deployment containing sensitive data must have a label like data sensitivity high.
So we're basically tagging those sensitive deployments.
Right, and once you have those labels in place, you can create other policies that restrict how those labeled deployments interact with the outside world.
Okay, so give me an example.
Sure, you could have a policy that prevents any deployment with the data sensitivity high label from being exposed on a public network.
Ah, so even if a developer accidentally misconfigures their deployment, that extra layer of protection would prevent sensitive data from being accessible to the public.
Exactly. It's like a safety net.
I like it.
Yeah, it helps you catch those mistakes before they turn into a major security breach.
Now, one of the other articles you sent over mentioned using gatekeepers to enforce resource limits.
Yes.
Why is that so important?
Resource limits are really important for maintaining the stability and performance of your Kubernetes cluster. Without them, a single misbehaving application could consume all the available resources like CPU and memory, and that could bring down the entire system.
Ouch, that sounds bad.
It can be, especially in a large multi-tenant cluster where multiple teams are sharing resources.
Yeah, you don't want one team's application to hog all the resources and starve everyone else.
Exactly, and that's where gatekeepers can help by enforcing resource quotas. You can use constraint templates to create policies that define the maximum amount of CPU memory or other resources that each deployment is allowed to consume.
So it's like setting up boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. It prevents one application from taking more than its fair share.
That makes a lot of sense.
And it helps ensure that all of your applications have the resources they need to function properly.
You know, thinking about all these potential risks and how gatekeepers can mitigate them, it almost feels like having a security consultant built right into our Kubernetes cluster.
It's kind of like that, yeah. It gives you those expert insights and recommendations without having to hire a dedicated security consultant.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's one of the things that makes Gatekeeper so valuable.
And the fact that it's based on open standards and has the backing of the CNCF gives me a lot of confidence.
Yeah, it means you're not locked into a proprietary solution and you have a strong community to support you.
Speaking of community, I saw in one of those articles that you can even integrate gatekeepers with CI/CD pipelines.
Yes, that's a great example of how gatekeepers can be used to shift security left.
Remind me what that means again.
It means integrating security earlier in the development process. So by integrating gatekeepers with your CI/CD pipelines, you can catch policy violations much earlier before they ever reach the cluster.
So instead of waiting until a deployment reaches the cluster, we can run those policy checks as part of our automated build and test processes.
Exactly. So it's like having a security checkpoint built into your CI/CD pipeline.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, it prevents bad deployments from ever reaching the cluster in the first place.
That saves everyone a lot of headaches.
It does. It saves time, reduces risk, and it empowers developers to take ownership of security.
Now, I'm curious how Gatekeeper handles more complex policy scenarios.
Okay.
Let's say we have a policy that requires all deployments to be approved by a specific team before they can be rolled out. Can gatekeepers handle something like that?
Absolutely. You can use Gatekeeper's webhook capabilities to integrate with external approval systems.
Okay.
For example, you could trigger a webhook that sends a notification to the approval team whenever a new deployment is requested.
So it's like adding a manual checkpoint into the automated deployment process.
Exactly, and that approval step could even be automated as well.
How so?
Well, you could integrate with a system that automatically approves deployments based on certain criteria, like the time of day or the developer's role.
So we can build in both manual and automated approval processes depending on our needs.
Exactly. It gives you a lot of flexibility in how you implement those policies.
That's really impressive.
Yeah. Gatekeepers is designed to be adaptable to a wide range of use cases.
You know, one thing that's becoming clear to me is that gatekeepers isn't just about enforcing strict rules and blocking actions.
Right.
It's also about enabling developers to do the right thing, even when they're working independently.
Yeah, I agree. It's about providing guardrails, not roadblocks.
Exactly. It's about empowering developers to move fast without compromising security.
That's a great way to put it.
And that's a key takeaway for me. Gatekeepers isn't just a security tool. It's a tool that helps foster a security-conscious culture within an organization.
That's a great point. It's about shifting the mindset and making security everyone's responsibility.
Now let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the human side of implementing gatekeepers.
Okay.
In one of the articles you sent over,
Yeah.
they really emphasize the importance of communication and collaboration when rolling out gatekeepers.
Right.
Why is that so crucial?
Implementing Gatekeeper is not just a technical challenge. It's also a cultural shift.
Okay.
You're changing the way people work, and that requires clear communication and buy-in from all stakeholders.
So it's not just about deploying software.
No.
It's about bringing people along on the journey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Developers need to understand why Gatekeeper is being implemented, how it will affect their workflows, and how they can contribute to the process.
And I imagine operations teams also need to be involved.
Absolutely. They're the ones who will be managing the Gatekeeper infrastructure.
Right, so it's a team effort, not a solo mission.
Exactly. And open communication is key.
Yeah, you need to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Right. You need to create a culture where people feel comfortable asking questions, raising concerns, and sharing feedback.
Now, in one of these articles, they mentioned creating a Gatekeeper Champions program.
Yes.
What's that all about?
That's a great idea. It's a way to foster adoption and build internal expertise. The idea is to identify enthusiastic individuals within different teams who can become experts in gatekeepers.
Okay.
And then they can help others get up to speed.
So it's like creating a network of internal evangelists.
Exactly. They can spread the good word about gatekeepers and help smooth the transition.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's a great way to build momentum and get everyone excited about using gatekeepers.
Now let's talk about the challenges of implementing gatekeepers.
Okay.
No system is perfect, so what are some of the potential pitfalls that we need to watch out for?
Well, one common challenge is policy sprawl.
What's that?
It's basically what happens when you create too many policies.
Okay.
And it can become difficult to manage and understand all those policies if you're not careful.
So it's like anything else. You can have too much of a good thing.
Exactly. You need to find the right balance between having enough policies to ensure security and not having so many that it becomes overwhelming.
Right. Another article mentioned the risk of creating policies that are too restrictive.
Yes.
And end up hindering development velocity.
That's definitely something to watch out for. If your policies are too strict, they can slow down development cycles and frustrate developers.
Yeah, so it's not just about writing policies that are secure.
Right.
They also need to be practical and usable in a real-world development environment.
Exactly. You need to design policies that are both effective and pragmatic.
And that's where communication and collaboration come in again.
It does. You need to involve developers in the policy creation process to make sure that the policies are aligned with their workflows and don't create unnecessary roadblocks.
So to sum up this whole conversation about the challenges, it sounds like the key is to strike the right balance.
Yes.
Between security, agility, and usability.
Exactly. You need to find that sweet spot where you're mitigating risk without stifling innovation.
All right, so we've talked about the benefits, the implementation process, the potential challenges. What's the key takeaway you want listeners to walk away with from this conversation about gatekeepers?
I would say this Gatekeeper is a powerful tool that can significantly enhance the security of your Kubernetes environment, but it's not a silver bullet.
Okay.
It requires careful planning, communication, and ongoing attention to ensure that it's effective and doesn't create unintended consequences.
I think that's a really important point. It's easy to get excited about a new tool and see it as a solution to all your problems.
Yeah.
But the reality is that any tool is only as good as the people who are using it.
Exactly. Technology is only part of the equation. You also need the right processes, culture, and people to make it work effectively.
All right, the next part, let's explore some real-world examples of how organizations are using gatekeepers to solve specific security challenges.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
All right, so we've talked a lot about the theory behind gatekeepers.
We have.
But I always find the best way to really understand something is to see it in action.
I agree. Real-world examples are always helpful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's dive into some case studies and see how organizations are using gatekeepers to solve real security challenges in their Kubernetes environments.
Okay, sounds good.
You sent over an article about a company that used gatekeepers to prevent container escapes.
Yeah, that was a really interesting one.
Can you remind me what happened there?
So this company was running a multi-tenant Kubernetes cluster, which means they had multiple teams deploying applications in the same environment. And one of the teams accidentally misconfigured their deployment, and their container ended up gaining escalated privileges within the cluster.
Oh, that sounds bad.
It could have been really bad.
Yeah.
Fortunately, they had gatekeepers in place with a policy that specifically prohibited containers from running with root privileges.
So even though the deployment was misconfigured,
Yeah.
gatekeepers stepped in and prevented a potential security breach.
Exactly. Gatekeeper was like that last line of defense.
That's a really powerful example of how gatekeepers can prevent those "oh no" moments.
Yeah, it's like having a safety net.
What other examples did you find?
Well, another case study I came across involved a company in the healthcare space.
Okay.
And they needed to comply with IPA, which has very strict rules about protecting patient data.
Right, that's a big one.
Yeah, they used gatekeepers to define policies that ensured all deployments handling patient data were encrypted both at rest and in transit.
So they're covering all their bases.
Yeah, and they also implemented policies that restricted access to those deployments, so only authorized personnel could access that sensitive information.
It sounds like they were really taking a comprehensive approach to security and compliance.
They were using Gatekeeper to address both the technical and the procedural aspects of HIPAA compliance.
I like that. Now, those are examples of how gatekeepers can prevent bad things from happening. But I also saw an example where a company was using gatekeepers to actually promote security best practices.
Oh, yeah, that was a great one. They called it their Secure by Default initiative.
Right. Tell me more about that.
So they basically defined a set of baseline security policies that applied to all deployments within their Kubernetes cluster.
So instead of waiting for security issues to pop up, they were taking a proactive approach.
Exactly. They were baking security into their environment from the ground up.
And what kind of policies were they including in this baseline?
Well, things like enforcing resource limits, restricting network access, and requiring the use of approved container images.
So every deployment by default adhered to a set of security best practices.
Right, even if developers didn't explicitly configure them.
That's a really smart approach.
It shifts the burden of security from the individual developers to the platform itself.
I like that it's about making the secure path the easiest path.
Exactly. You want to make it easy for developers to do the right thing.
These examples are great.
Yeah, they really highlight the versatility of gatekeepers.
Yeah, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a flexible tool that can be adapted to different needs and different scenarios.
Exactly. And the best part is that it's constantly evolving. The community is always developing new features and extensions.
So Gatekeeper is going to keep getting better and better.
It's a really exciting project to be following.
Well, this has been a fantastic deep dive.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it.
Me too. We've learned a lot about gatekeepers, why it's important, how to implement it,
right,
and how it's being used in the real world.
And some of the challenges, too.
Right, because no system is perfect.
Exactly.
But with careful planning and execution,
yeah,
gatekeepers can be a really powerful tool for securing your Kubernetes environments.
It can really make a difference.
So to everyone listening out there,
yeah,
if you're running Kubernetes and you're not already using gatekeepers, I highly encourage you to check it out.
It's worth exploring.
It is. And remember, security is not just about technology. Right.
It's about people and processes, too.
Absolutely.
So build a security-conscious culture. Collaborate with your teams.
Yeah.
And stay up to date on the latest best practices.
Good advice.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into gatekeepers.
Thanks for having me.
And until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those Kubernetes clusters secure.
See you next time.